Hello and welcome everyone to the Tadaima Virtual Pilgrimage. My name is Rob Busher and I am the Film Festival Curator for our online program. I'm also the Board Chair of the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. Today I'm being joined by Sheridan Tatsuno, and we're going to have a conversation about his father, Dave Tatsuno's work in recording home movies inside of the Topaz Relocation Center, as well as a number of other interesting anecdotes about both Dave and Sheridan's life in San Jose. And from there, we'll also discuss some of the unique perspectives that Sheridan has, having spent a great deal of time living in Japan himself, especially during the 80s and 90s and during the so-called US-Japan trade war. So thank you for joining us today, Sheridan.
Hi, greetings from San Francisco. I'm pleased to meet everybody. I hope you're going to enjoy the program that we have coming up.
So to give a little bit of context here, the reason we're talking with Sheridan today is because one of the films in week 3 is Dave Tatsuno, Movies and Memories. It's a terrific hour-long documentary that was produced for public television in the San Jose area. And it's available if you guys want to watch it. So go check that out if you haven't had a chance to already. Today, we're really going to be talking a lot about the importance of recording these kinds of memories, but also about the great work that Dave did during his life to kind of build community in the San Jose area for the Japanese American community. So I guess with that, I'd love to just kind of jump right in here, Sheridan. You know, based on our previous conversation and certainly in the film, it's obvious that your father was very involved in his local community of San Jose during the post-war era. Can you share some anecdotes about his relationships with both the Japanese American community and the mainstream community, and any other memories that you have of growing up in San Jose?
Well, I mean, my father has an advantage because we were one of the first Japanese Americans in San Francisco. My grandfather came from Nagano 1893, and there were only a couple of hundred Japanese men, and they lived in Chinatown then. So and then he set up his store, Nichibei Busan, which we still have in San Jose, Japantown, in 1902. So we were somewhat of a community center for the Japanese community since 1902. And then after the earthquake, 1907, in the Western Addition, Japantown, in San Francisco, and all the Japanese Americans shopped at our place to buy, Western clothes and even kimonos. And then in San Jose in 1948, he opened up the shop when we moved there. So we still are somewhat of a community center for the community, going back 117 years now. So we were well known even before he took his Topaz home movies, and so that's a big advantage. And then if you go to the website, it's nbstore.com, you could see the history, and you could see the history about our family, and then what preceded us, from the 1890s and then to the camps.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing to think that, as your family established themselves fairly early on as Issei purveyors of goods, one of the things that we saw in the film was that Dave also spent a great deal of time of his camp years managing one of the dry goods stores in Topaz.
Right. So he was a retailer, so he understood. That's why they chose him to run the cooperative, the store, because he managed Nisei, working at the store and being in Japantown, San Francisco. So it was easy for him to do the co-op. He had to do the buying. He couldn't buy on the West Coast. He'd have to go nationwide, and of course, goods were scarce, so he had to negotiate with all the white sellers and wholesalers to get whatever he could. And it wasn't easy during World War II because everything was rationed. But he was pretty good at that. So he would usually buy in Chicago and New York. And he was one of the few people who got out of the camp to go. That's why he had these home pictures and movies of New York and downtown and running around. And he was only Japanese American out there free.
Did your father tell you about those experiences, what it must have been like for him to be out of camp and be interacting with people when the rest of his family, of course, and the community was incarcerated?
Well, I mean, in general, most Americans even didn't even know about the camps, right? And then outside of California, most people had never met a Japanese Americans, so they often thought he was Chinese because there are Chinese, in all the different cities. But when they said he was Japanese, then they kind of stepped back because remember we're at war with Japan. But he said, "No, I'm in Topaz, Utah." And what's that? He goes, "It's a concentration camp." He said, "What are you talking about?" Because there was no news about. It was a total blackout, the news blackout about the camps. So nobody knew about it, and he was all by himself running around, confused for Chinese first, and then when he told about actually many of the Americans in the East Coast. Probably because there was no anti-Japanese feeling, because no Japanese Americans were actually sympathetic. They felt sorry for me. Like, oh, that's sad. You're in a city in a concentration camp by yourself, And so they actually felt sorry for him. He used to use that to get the sympathy from the, the wholesalers. And because he was single, he could talk to them. And I encountered the same thing when I went back east. I was undergraduate, at Yale, and I spent 8 years back east. And most people have never met a Japanese Americans in the East Coast. So I encountered the same thing, 50 years later, 30 years later, and nobody knew anything about Japanese Americans. So I had to explain everything. What is a Japanese American? There are communities, everything. And so you really have to start from scratch. And that was the same with my father.
Yeah, we are few and far between here on the East Coast, and I can only imagine in the 40s, and then certainly when you were in college in the 60s and 70s, that must have been an interesting experience, to say the least. I'm curious, though, if you can elaborate a little bit more about what was your father's role kind of in the local community in San Jose? Through the film, we obviously see that he was deeply committed to the YMCA, and of course, the store itself is very important for the Japanese American community. I understand, though, that he also had relationships with some of the local politicians and power brokers. Wondering if you could share some more about that.
Okay, so he lived. He was born 1913. Lived in San Francisco until 1948 when he moved our family to San Jose. And when he was in San Francisco, he was a JCL president with Mike Masaoka during the war when they interrogated and FBI came in. So he had all that background before the war. And the reason why he took the whole movie basically is the Toland Committee lied. And he told me about it, but it's never written down anywhere. And where, when he walked in with Mike, the first thing they expected him to say hello. Did you know that Japs were found with the dead Jap pilots were found with a UCLA ring on their finger in Hawaii? Did you know that the Jap off coast was found shelling Long Beach? All fake, all false. And they were trying to get them to jump to see if they would say anything. But my father, of course, being an East at Cal, didn't know anything about anything. He just said, we don't know anything because we're Americans. Later, when the Toland Committee came out, the report, actually, my dad got a copy. The first 5 are deleted, all the false accusations. And then the opening goes, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for coming." So my father said he doesn't trust the U.S. government because of what happened there, because they lied, they deleted, and then to cover up. And then, of course, during the war and afterward, they just, whitewashed the whole camp to make it look like a summer camp. Everybody's having fun. They never showed the gun towers, never showed the book, So it was just total whitewash. So that's why my dad, he's Christian, so this concept of Christian witness, and that it's like eyewitness, that what's morally wrong, I'm going to document. So he actually wrote a diary every day of his life, 1926 on. And then he had an 8mm home movie camera, says a name. He wanted it. So in the New York Times obituary, you could see that his YMCA friends snuck it in because they didn't check the YMCA or the Mormon ministers coming into the camp. So that's how he got it with the film. So he said to me all the time when I was a child, he said, I'm going to take these movies in 2.5 years in camp to document it as proof that this happened, that the government can never lie to anybody and deny that ever happened. And he said, long after we're gone, centuries from now, people know what happened in Topaz. He used to tell me that all the time, that he had this historic sense of witness. In other words, if you can't stop the army, you can't do anything, at least record it. Write it down, take movies, pictures, just like what they're doing now with social media, and create something as evidence, because it's really about like eyewitness. You're witnessing a crime, in this case, violation of common rights. So it's as a good citizen, but also as a Christian witness, is when you see a moral wrong, you have an obligation to witness it and document. And that's what he always used to emphasize to me.
It's really remarkable that he had that foresight to think about, that moment in history as he was living it and understand the role that he could have in documenting that. And so I think, some of what he did too, knowing the role of the history, then I would imagine he tried to bring this into the public into some capacity. I remember in the film, one of the quotes that you had was that you were talking about memories of diving, but also memories of watching the home movies anytime that there were guests over at the house. Wondering if you could kind of elaborate a little bit more about the role that the home movies played in his interactions with friends and family and other guests.
Well, my father was a big home movie buff. I think we have 10,000 feet of color home movie since 1936. And after the war, when we were a little kid, and every time friends came over, and you say friends, Caucasian, anybody, he'd pop out his home movies and show us, and always show the cat movies, but then all the after the war and before the war and all. And he'd do blah, blah, blah. And so, frankly, all of us kids got sick and tired of seeing Topaz because we saw it so many times. But the interesting thing about it is that we saw it before the war, Topaz after war. We saw it so many times. It's like my brother said, I'm not sure if I remember it or if I saw it in Dad's movies. Because it was like Hollywood. We saw the movies on television, Hollywood. And so I was like an actor on the screen, just like the Hollywood stars in the movies, because for us, there was a difference between a home movie and a Hollywood movie. So my brother and I said, yeah, it feels kind of weird. We feel like we're actors in a movie. And we never saw Asian actors in Hollywood movies, but we were the prime actors and heroes and all that in our home movies. So it's kind of this weird combination of what's reality, what's fantasy, what's real, what's not real, what's film, what's not film. For us as children, they all merged. So this kind of different sense of consciousness and then I found out later, none of my Sansei friends had ever heard about the camp because all the Nisei kept quiet because, shame, embarrassment. And so I said, what's the matter with you guys? Don't your parents talk at all? Mm-hmm. And then by contrast, my father was like, just like our ears would bleed. He would talk about it so much, all the stories. So it's kind of very unusual. So needless to say, all the Nisei friends would just love the camp movies because they could see the camp. And then secondly, my dad would talk about it and it was okay. And then all the stories came out. All and they say, oh yeah, David, this is weird, block 42 or whatever. And you would hear all the stories spilling out of them all the time because it was okay to talk with my father, look at the home movies, but in public, they would never talk. Never. I never heard anybody talk about camp until Redress, 1980s, or Manslaughter, 1973 for LA, but actually 1980. So they kept quiet for 45 years.
It's pretty remarkable the role that your father's film could play in helping others to open up about their own camp experience. And I know that you mentioned in the past you did have opportunity to show your father's films on the East Coast when you were in college. I'm wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about that and maybe some of your other experiences in general, being one of maybe a handful of Japanese Americans at Yale.
Yeah, and I didn't show it at Yale. My father went there, so they met him, and then they asked about the camp, but he didn't show the home movies. But later, I was at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and Urban Planning, and then we had an Asian American group there, and they wanted to show the camp. So we put it on at Harvard Law School, the big auditorium, thinking, we'd have a handful of Asian Americans. Wrong. It was like 90% white. And all the law students and professors and sociologists from all over New England showed up. People came in from New York to see it. And we were going, what's going on here? All the Harvard law professors showed up, and I'm going, what's going on? Why do you care about the Japanese American experience? He said, oh, we're studying Korematsu in law school. That is the foundation case for all civil rights and discrimination suits. And I had studied it a little bit in housing law, the housing discrimination. Korematsu, that's a foundation case. So, basically race is a suspect classification. So all the students, everybody came in, and it wasn't so much about the Asian, obviously not Asian American, about the experience, so that they were interested in that. It's really about the constitutional violations, right? Because can't violate, 5 or 6 constitutional rights, which nobody really has explored in detail. So besides right to trial and all these things. So I think that's a very interesting spin that I picked out of the Harvard Law presentation. Because most Nisei groups look more at the experience as a personal family experience, not the legal issues. But the bigger issue, and it's not just for the United States, it's really, if you look at detention camps, like, the ICE camps, and around the world in prison camps under the UN, it's really what are human rights and constitutional rights of refugees or detained people. And that's the bigger issue. And that's why the camp is relevant.
So I think you had also mentioned you had the opportunity to show the home movies in some of the Japantown areas, as well as LA, the greater LA area. And I'm guessing that was probably in the lead up to Redress. Wondering if you might be able to elaborate a little bit on that.
So again, LA actually, because they had the Mansour committee, I was a member of the committee when Sue Embry ran it. And we are the ones who developed the plaque for the manslaughter. And I can get into that. But they were the first people to actually on the West Coast to talk about the camps, besides my father. So I was really happy. I said, gee, somebody's finally talking about it. And they said, you have home movies, so Sheridan, why don't you show them? So what we'll do is we'll have 4 screenings. We had it downtown LA, Little Tokyo. And then we had at West LA, we had Gardena and Long Beach. And we had huge turnouts because nobody had ever seen a camp movie before. Okay, they'd seen other things, but not, government propaganda movies. So huge turnout. And I was kind of surprised. So now I'd seen the movie so many times, I gave the spiel. So I didn't care so much about what was on the screen because I've seen it. But I was watching the audience, and what really struck me was the visceral response, the physical response, which I didn't expect. So I thought we'd hear a lot of wailing, crying, and blah, 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 like Greek chorus of crying. Wrong. I heard a lot of coughing. And all the different events, especially in Little Tokyo and Gardena and Long Beach, many of the East, they got in the front row, I noticed, or, they're there. And then I heard all this coughing, and I'm like, what's going on? Is there the air conditioning on, or what's going on here? So I was looking at everybody coughing. I'm going, what's going on? Why is everybody coughing? And then they were coughing, and then they would pull up their handkerchief and then wipe their eyes. And being Japanese American, you don't cry in public, so they were trying to cover up their crying. And only the Japanese Americans did. I showed a Caucasian, of course. Most people are saddened, or other people, but only the Japanese Americans use handkerchiefs. It was pretty intense. I was watching them, and then some of them came up to me like, oh, literally, the Nisei woman, they all broke down, and he said it was like a punch in the stomach. So he said, when we left camp, we thought we'd never see it. God forbid, we'll never see the camp again. And suddenly, bam, color, and you can see all of us running around like kids. He said that was a shock. It was like really traumatic. I remember a lot of Nisei. They were just, it was like almost so traumatic they couldn't even like hold themselves together. It was pretty intense. And then the Sansei were like, what's going on? Because they knew nothing about the camp. So 3 very, very different responses. the Issei crying like mad, covering it up. The Nisei like breaking out crying or just like shock. And then the Sansei like mystified. It's like, what in the heck is this? Because they knew nothing. And it was, for me, that was, the generational differences were pretty profound. I was always kind of fascinated by that. And it's based on your experiences.
It is pretty remarkable, and I think it's a great example of just how intergenerational trauma works. And having that kind of barrier of silence, obviously viscerally revealed when people do have that opportunity to see this footage. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable too. And watching the film, I was really interested in the fact that your father and your family did visit Topaz in 1955, and I think that was pretty remarkable because I don't really know of any other Japanese Americans who went to visit the campsites prior to the Manzanar pilgrimage in the late 60s. So I'm just kind of curious if you have memories from that trip, or if you might be able to tell us a little bit about that.
I was 5 then, and then so I remember it very clearly. And I was going, we heard about camps on the movies, but it was all in air conditioned places, right? So I got the camp. It was hotter than hell, middle of August, and we're going straight out on a dirt road, and then it's like farms as you see in the movies, and then it goes out, and then it's desert, and it's really bad, 100-something degrees, hotter than hell, and then at 5 o'clock the mosquitoes came out. And it was like literally like attacking you, and we had to leave at 5 because the mosquitoes got so bad, or 6 o'clock. Totally desolate. And I was going, are you kidding? You stayed in this crappy place for 4 years. And so it was pretty intense. So my brother and I ran around and saw that, nobody had been there. I think we were one of the first people to go there. So everything was like a lot of stuff left over, and then he had the concrete blocks and stuff. And we saw the little Japanese gardens that people made, the rocks and all that. So, and nobody really had touched back then. Now the big emotional thing for us was we were walking around, and we finally found our foundation where our family lived, and we were walking around, and my little sister goes, "Hey, check this out, little Tinker Toy." And I'm, oh. So I look at the Tinker Toy, and then we bring it over, and then all of a sudden my mom takes it and breaks out crying. And we're all going, and we all got around her because she's crying. And I'm going, what's going on? And she goes, well, that's the Tinker Toy from your oldest son, Sheldon, who died 2 years after camp in 1947 from a tonsillectomy. And what happened when we left camp in 1945, he dropped his Tinker Toys. And we couldn't go back to get him because, everybody said, we've got to bus, we've got to leave and all. So he was crying the whole time on the bus. So she said, as soon as we found the Tinker Toy right near the floor, 10 years later. And boy, that was pretty intense for my mother and my family because, that was the dead son, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, there are experiences like, and now we went in 93 with, and that was a big pilgrimage. So it was a lot more fun because everybody was there by ourselves. But then we had a really interesting thing happen there. So I was walking around, more of it was picked off by then, and more organized, and they hit the monument and all. So I'm sitting there in our RV the next morning, and I said, damn, I said, I wanted to meet one of the 442nd guys, I want to hear their stories and all that, and going from camp, but fighting in, World War II, right? I said, damn, I'd give my left arm to meet a 442nd soldier, right? So right. 30 minutes later, this car pulls up, right? And there's this couple that comes out, and they're checking out, Caucasian wife and Japanese American guy, right? And so my father, let's bring them in and invite them for coffee. So we walk outdoors, right? And we're sitting there and standing there looking at him, and I'm looking at this guy, and he didn't have a left arm. And he said, yeah. He goes, I lost it in the 442nd. Dad and Noah and I are the two guys who lost our left arms on. And then he told us about 442nd. So my dad turns to me and goes, that's weird. I said, yeah, I have that because I have intuition, deja vu. Often it happens to me a lot. And he said, I actually got my wish 30 minutes later with a 4-for-second bet without his left arm. That was weird. And he told us the stories. So, I mean, those are the two memorable events from Topaz.
Yeah, it's really something, and I think for folks who haven't been able to visit a site yet in person, I mean that's why it's so important that we can have at least these virtual conversations, despite the fact that we can't gather safely in person. I guess I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit more to some of your own experiences. It's when we spoke last, you told me some very interesting stories, kind of about not just your time on the East Coast and kind of dealing with being one of the few Japanese Americans there, but also about the times that you spent living in Japan. And I understand that you both taught English there and then later returned to do work with some Japanese corporations. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I learned to speak Japanese. That was my last language, my fourth language. So I studied German first in high school, and French and Spanish in college. And then in my senior year, I said, because I skipped out of Japanese classes when I was a child. My brothers and sisters hated Japanese because they had to go. I got out, went to the YMCA on Saturdays. And so I didn't have a negative feeling about Japanese language when I was in college. And that was part of the Asian identity, rediscovery, the whole Roots thing. Because Roots, by Alex Haley came out in 1973 on PBS. So a lot of us Asian Americans went into the Roots thing. And then many Japanese Americans out of college went to Japan to rediscover their roots. And I was one of them. But I took Japanese at Yale and I almost bombed it. And the problem was I hadn't studied it before. And so all the Caucasian kids were, sons and daughters of missionaries. And so they spoke it fairly well. And then the teachers were going, "What's wrong with you?" My father's fluent in Japanese. My mother's semi-fluent. My father's totally bilingual, bicultural. People think he's Japanese because he spent so much time at Ishibei-Busan de Issei for 50 years. So he was Japanese. So I told him, "I'm sorry, language is socially acquired, not genetically inherited." And they got really mad at me. They said, "Namaiki," I was like, "I'm sorry." But I said, "It takes 12 years for you to learn your own kanji. How do you expect me to learn it in one semester?" But anyway, it was really stiff because the Japanese Americans didn't speak the language. I didn't know anything. I couldn't read it at all. I went to Japan. Of course, when you're in Japan, everybody assumes you're Japanese. So they all thought I was the village idiot. So I couldn't speak the language. I couldn't read the language, anything. So what I would do is get the manga and hide my Japanese textbook inside to learn the kanji. So I'd be reading. And then a lot of times on the bus, these people, "Oh, must be a good manga." So they look over my shoulder. And then I had the hiragana, katakana, text and all that to learn the basic Japanese. And then the kids would laugh, say, "He's the village idiot." This is old guy, 20-something, who can't even read basic Japanese. And they used to laugh. And just terrible. Anyway, so I was there. I was exchange teacher of San Jose, Okayama, sister city. They couldn't find any teachers, and because they weren't paying enough, retired English teachers from San Jose. So there's this other fellow and I. We graduated, young college students, and then we taught through 30 junior high schools, so Okayama for a year and a half. So I taught probably 10,000 junior high school students one time each, and they said you should forbear after that because everybody knew me in town. But I learned Japanese there. I studied kanji. I studied 2,000 kanji in 2 years there. So after the time I was there, I could read all the signs. And then I learned Japanese. Then later I met my wife at the very end, just before I left. I had a girlfriend already. So contrary to popular belief, I didn't go there to find a wife. Okay. So a lot of Japanese American women or Asian women go, "You're such a loser. You went to Japan to find a wife because you couldn't, And I said, no, I had a girlfriend. And I thought going to marry her, but thing fell apart. And I ended up marrying the woman I met in Okayama, who just before I left. So we married. And so I was married for 27 years. I spoke Japanese. So my Japanese is actually pretty good now. So I used to work at this in tech, and we had all the big Japanese accounts. And I was the only employee at DataQuest in San Jose who spoke Japanese. So needless to say, all the corporations after lunch or dinner after 5 o'clock wanted to take me out to dinner to find out what's really going on. And of course, all the NEC, Fujitsu, Tashi, Toshiba, all of them, like 5 or 6 executives eating and drinking. They said, no English, we're tired, we can't speak English, let's use Japanese. So I had to learn Japanese to explain everything, Silicon Valley technology, everything in Japanese with executives there in Tokyo, or in San Jose and in Tokyo. So my Japanese is, I'm not good in Keigo, which is the formal Japanese, kind of stiff, but that's not where the action happens. It's all after 5 o'clock when you're eating and drinking, right? That's where all the really good stuff comes out, and Japanese open up. So I'm better operating in the bars, restaurants, drinks, and just like going freestyle with them. And so I could do that, and I used to present in, oh gosh, all the 80s and 90s. They would bring me in like Hitachi. I'd work with the Hitachi computing teams in Tokyo Station, or like Canon for like years. I'd go in there into the headquarters. Nobody spoke English, so all Japanese. Have to do all my meetings all around the clock in Japanese, present in Japanese, discuss in Japanese, eat and drink in Japanese. So needless to say, my Japanese got pretty good. So many people think I was born there and then left when I was maybe in teens, because I'm not current with the latest slang. My Japanese is fairly standard, Tokyo. Tokyo, because one of the dangers of speaking Japanese informally is they don't respect you. Because Japan is always politeness first, and then you ratchet down as you get to know people. So you tend to do very kind of standard Japanese, or more polite Japanese, and then gradually as you get to know people, you kind of just chill. And then, but if you go the other way, it's considered rude or not educated. So I tend to I always err on the high side first, and then go down into informal Japanese, or just casual Japanese.
I think it's really interesting because you spent time in Japan when I think we saw the most anti-Japanese animosity in the United States since the Second World War in terms of the US-Japan trade war. I guess I'm wondering if you might be able to comment a little bit on what that experience was like, especially working overseas between US and Japanese corporations, and some of the conversations that were being held at that time with the government.
Yeah, I was involved in the semiconductor trade fight. Okay, so in 1981, MITI, actually 1980, MITI, the Ministry of International Trade in Japan, had the VLSI project, which is to create the 256 DRAM memory chip. And between 1981 and 1982, American market share for DRAM, Japanese market share went from 30% to 70%. They blew away Intel, National, AMD. They almost destroyed the American semiconductor industry in 18 months. Sort of like Detroit with the cars. So needless to say, the anti-Japanese feeling was super intense, like Detroit and Silicon Valley. People didn't trust Japan. They called it the second invasion. Everything that you've heard about out of Detroit when we had in Silicon Valley. But there was this, it's like many of the feelings are toward China, today, but pretty intense. So, of course, I'm the data quest guy in semiconductors to set up the Japanese service in order to teach foreigners and Americans how to deal with Japanese, right? And I was studying the Japanese corporate strategy, government policies, in addition to the markets and everything. And then we had 3,000 corporate accounts in tech worldwide, plus the governments. Basically, DataQuest, where I was, we were the Silicon Valley Information Center. All right. In fact, one guy said, "Here are the closest thing to a private CIA," and goes, "That's correct. We know everything about anybody in tech. We had 31 industries, and so I saw all the deals. Behind closed doors. I could walk into any corporation in Europe, U.S., Asia, Japan that was a client, like Siemens or IBM, and go right into the board, into the executives, because they wanted to Japan. So they used to ask me about Japan. So, I probably advised like 900 companies when I was there, all the top. Like, for example, in Europe, IBM Europe is my account, Siemens, Thomson, Olivetti, Bosch, right? The UK government, European governments, Wales, Scotland, all of them. Asia was like Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, U.S. government, Department of Commerce, White House, Pentagon. Okay, all of them were worried about Japan. So my boss and I were the two Westerners who knew about everything about the Japanese semiconductor industry and companies. And then we had all the Japanese accounts. So Hitachi and Nissan, all of them. So we not only knew them and academically, we used to drink with them all the time in Tokyo. So all the trade fight was going on. Interesting. There was Glenn Fukushima was part of the USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, and he was representing the U.S. government. So he had to be critical of the U.S. government, right? DataQuest, we were doing all the backdoor deals because they were our business clients. So both sides, even though they're fighting, it's political, I call it kabuki theater, they had to look tough for the media. They were cutting deals behind closed doors. Guess who's sitting on all the deals? My boss and I were. We were like, I was sitting with Matsushita and Zilog, cutting these billion-dollar deals, how to work together. So I wrote all about U.S.-Japan semiconductor alliances, which is how they resolved it. So instead of fighting each other, they partnered up. And we helped put together many of the deals. But it was all top secret because I was always under NDA, non-disclosure. So the challenge was that for 7 years, I could never say anything. In fact, DataQuest said, one recommendation, you should not invest in tech stocks. And I said, why not? He goes, it's called insider trading. You wind up in federal prison. I said, no. He goes, do not invest in tech stock because you're going to hear too much. I heard all the dirt on all these tech companies and all the industries. I swear, if someone had done it, it would have been billionaire by now. But I could never invest because I heard way too much, like all sorts of stuff that you'll never see in the press. So that was, and I saw U.S.-Japan though. So I was there because MITI, the government, was our client, like Department of Commerce was our client. So I was talking to both sides with them. And it's very unusual. And then, of course, when we're talking to the Japanese, both in San Jose and Tokyo, it was always in Japanese. Like, well, for my boss, it was in English because Caucasian. But after 5, they'd say, it's like, can we speak Japanese? Sure. So they would just launch in Japanese, and then you would hear all the stuff from the Japanese, half drunk, And you could ask them whatever you want, and they're pretty blunt sometimes. Because Japanese, when they're drunk, they're pretty straight. They don't pull punches. They'll tell you exactly what they think. Now, in 1987, I remember I said, this is the peak, because I went to all the companies to say hello, and they lectured me for 30 to 50 minutes in Japanese on why this is the American disease and why America's over, the century's over. And I said, oh, wow, pretty arrogant people. And I said, I think this is the peak of Japan. And sure enough, 1989, the recession for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
But I was there at the very peak, and I heard it directly from all the executives.
Well, it's pretty remarkable too, because I think, a lot of people think of U.S.-Japan relations as these sort of, bilateral agreements, but from people who are representing one or the other side. And I think in certain ways, Japanese Americans have certainly been caught in the middle, as we all know from the World War II era. But to your credit, being able to integrate yourself into those conversations and I think do work in a way that was good for both countries. And so great credit to yourself and the work that you guys were able to do.
I had a big advantage, okay? And the reason is that even before I spoke Japanese, when I got to Japan, because I have relatives there, I said, kimochi na wakaru ne. It's like, it feels like home. And so I intuitively kind of just like, and in Japan, it's always about how to get, your stomach language. It's how you connect on a personal level, not just language. So I know a lot of people like Caucasians, for example, speak fluent Japanese grammatically, but their kimochi is like total miss. Whereas you meet a lot of Japanese Americans who go to Japan, they don't speak Japanese well, but then boom, you immediately connect on an emotional level. Because remember, Japanese is heavily non-verbal. It's more kimochi.
Right.
And so if you cannot connect on an emotional, personal level, with Japanese, doesn't matter how good your Japanese is, because you'll never connect. And so they would always, Japanese would always tell, they said, yeah, we meet a lot of American government officials who are really good Japanese, but it's just like, they don't connect as a human. And that's a problem. So I think being Japanese American is an advantage, especially when the Japanese were drunk. They would open up and say, we can trust you because you're not one of them. I go, what do you mean not one of them? It goes, well, you understand. I said, yes, I understand you. And emotionally, even though sometimes I didn't agree with them.
Right.
But they would often say that. And still to this day, they say it, because my relative is, Japanese. He worked for NKK, Nippon Kokan. And I met him last month, and we had dinner, and we're all speaking Japanese. And, we've been buddies for 20 years. So, it's like family. So for me, there wasn't a difference between corporate family and my relatives, because they worked in tech companies too. So there wasn't a difference, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it looks like we have a question from the audience. Hanako Wakatsuki asks, Hi, Sheridan. Thank you for sharing. Did your family know the Korematsu family at Topaz? And did your father ever talk about them?
No, we didn't know them. We heard about him. Yeah, I mean, we were in totally different spheres. And I guess, my father was always, he was kind of behind the scenes because he had a shop and worked at the YMCA. He wasn't a political activist, even though he supported, Norm Mineta in the very beginning, and he was JCL president. So he was aware of the politics, but he wasn't an activist or, a legal person. So we were aware of it, but we weren't really that close to all the, Del Minami and all the civil rights and, constitutional rights issues. We were never really embedded in all the people. We were more the church, the YMCA, the Japanese American community, retail world. That was more of our environment.
I remember you in our last conversation mentioned another story involving Secretary Mineta and your father having something to do with his entry into politics. I was wondering if you might be willing to share that story.
Yeah, so Norman Mineta, we used to call him Norm because he was like an older brother to all of us in San Jose. Graduated from San Jose High School, where I graduated from. So he was like 20 years old or whatever. And his father ran an insurance company in Japantown, right down the street from my dad. So we knew the Minetas really well. And we also knew Helen Mineta, the relative. And, there's a whole background. The Masaoka family is related to the Minetas, right, through marriage and all. So there's a lot of black story there. But anyway, when Norm was a graduate at Cal, he came back and had to work for his father's insurance company because they didn't hire Japanese Americans in most places. And he wanted to go to law school, but didn't have money. So he had to work to save up to go to law school. And then he was frustrated. Now, my dad was in the central board of the YMCA because he had been part of the Buchanan YMCA. And then when he was in San Jose, he was so good at public speaking for the YMCA that they was invited to the board. So in the boardroom, he would meet all the different leaders of San Jose. And then, especially in the steam room. So he would swim me every lunchtime at the line and afterwards go to the steam room. And he took me with him many times. And I'd sit in there with the mayor and the scissors and the police and all of San Jose was there. All the political heavies were there. And they were cutting all the deals right there in the steam room. And so one day, I remember my father said, hey, guess what? San Jose Mayor Ron James, they have a Human Rights Commission, which they set up, I think, in 1966 after the rights. And there's an opening. And so Ron says, hey, we're looking for upstanding young Japanese American. Do you think anybody can be named? He goes, yeah, I met him. He's a Cal grad, like a fellow Cal grad, and he's frustrated as hell and smart and driven. So you should invite. So he said, yeah. So my father introduced Ron to Norm. And then next thing you know, he's appointed to human rights. And then Norm was an activist there. So, that's when he knocked down all the racial covenants in San Jose, housing, jobs, and everything, right? So San Jose became one of the most integrated communities in the United States, thanks to the Human Rights Commission and the mayor. And then next thing we know, he's on the city council. And then he ran. And then he was so active that he became the vice president of city council. And then he's kissing babies. So everybody thought in San Jose that Norm was the mayor. We used to laugh. Here comes Norm. He's going to kiss babies and shake hands, because Ron James didn't want to go out and kiss babies all the time to cut ribbons. So they sent Norm. So when he ran, the San Jose Mercury actually put an article saying, "Are the Japanese Americans capable of leadership?" And I said, that's bullshit. They can run their whole country and corporations that killed us. Of course they can run, but we just give them a chance. So he won handily, and he always had huge majorities. Okay, so when then he went into Congress. So my father was involved in getting Norm into the human rights, and then he took off. He was involved later after that. When he became congressman, then he came back to my dad. My dad sat on the San Jose Port Commission in 1958, again appointed by the mayor because of the YMCA, and they wanted an Asian Japanese American. So Norm goes, "Hey, I want to be on the aviation committee in Congress, FAA and all." My dad had a whole pile of FAA notes, like literally 4 feet high, I swear, of all the notes back. And he said, "Can I borrow all your notes?" So he said, "Sure." So Dad gave him all the notes, and Norm, being a really studious person, studied everything in detail and asked all these questions. Anything you want to know, I could tell you all about FAA operations. So then he got appointed there, and then they said, "How in the hell does Norm know so much?" And I goes, "Easy, my dad taught him everything. Plus he had all the notes for 10 years. So then later, of course, he was appointed to, the transportation secretary for 9/11, and which really came in handy because, it was so tense there. But Norm, because he had been on the aviation committee, was so knowledgeable about FAA operations. And needless to say, San Jose International Airport is named Norm Mineta San Jose International Airport, because he was one of the most knowledgeable people in the U.S. government in elected office who knew the detail about FAA operations.
Yeah, and it's amazing that that all kind of started in part due to your father, right, and that relationship that they had.
Yeah. So my dad was really happy, and the other thing too is when redress, because Norm was pushing it with him. So in a way, so when he saw, of course, my dad was really crying, and like a lot of news saying. But he said we finally did it, because he always told me, he says the reason why he got thrown in camp is we had no political protection. She says, I can't be a politician, but we need guys like Norm who could represent the Japanese community so we don't get thrown into camps like that. And so when Norm pushed ahead and then finally said, yeah, redress to go see, fine. It's like finally through Norm, I'm able to get art representation. So we are considered so he was, for him, it was kind of he was so proud of Norm, because Norm, went from the Human Rights Commission all the way into the cabinet. I mean, very few people do that.
Yeah, and I think one of the other remarkable stories later in your father's life is the fact that his home movies actually were added to the Library of Congress. And to my understanding, they're only one of 2 home movies that are part of the Library of Congress collection. Wondering if you might share some memory from when that was announced, maybe your father's reaction to that as well.
That was Karen. There's the Japanese American National Museum. Karen Ishimatsu was the head of the film collection there. And then that was her, actually. She said, hey, we need to be represented in the National Film Archive and Library of Congress. So she actually nominated us, and there were 2,000 submissions. And his was one of the 12 selected out of 2,000, 1996. But what Karen helped out, because it was just, silent, So Karen and Bob Nakamura, her husband, UCLA film professor, did the recording and synced it properly and edited it. So it was really nice. That's how they submitted it. So thanks to Karen Ishimatsu and Bob Nakamura, it was presentable as a submission. It wouldn't have been selected. And then it was one of the 12, I think MASH and some others were selected. So the Library of Congress only selects a few based on historical culture and political significance for the United States. So if you look at the list, you'll see the famous movies. So my friend called me he worked at Sony Pictures. He goes, hey, there's a guy named Dave Tatsuno, Topaz movie. You relate to him? He goes, that's my dad. He goes, it's with all the famous Hollywood movies, because all the studios look at that list when it comes out every year because they all want to be in it, right? And he goes, your dad's movie is famous, just like Gone to the Wind. I said, yep. And so that was really gratifying for my dad. But one of the things my dad used to brag about, he goes, you know, the Zapruder film with the Kennedy assassination, that was a pure accident. He was lucky to be there. He just got a couple of seconds. I had to sneak the camera and shoot it illegally under wraps for 2 years without getting busted. He goes, mine was much harder than the Zapruder film. So he used to always brag about that. And I said, okay, got it. But so yeah, that was shown in the Smithsonian tour of the United States. And yeah, so it's kind of his contribution, right, to Japanese American history.
Yeah, and I think you know, watching the film, I mean, he was such an impressive cinematographer. I mean, as an amateur, just looking at the way that he composed his shots, and even the way that he had a very editorial gaze in how he put together and spliced together different scenes.
Yeah.
Really phenomenal.
Yeah. I mean, nowadays you just shoot wildly because you have a lot free, and 2 minutes of expensive film forces you to think carefully. So he's like the old filmmakers where everything had to be conceived, no jitter, nothing. It had to be perfect the first time out because you only need 2 minutes of expensive film. So that's why he had to always kind of think through very carefully what he's going to show, compose all the scenes, and literally. Because he said, yeah, nowadays you just shoot wildly, and so there's a lot of editing.
So I guess now that the film is available in the Library of Congress, does that mean that people can access it through their collection?
I think so. Right now, he donated 2 copies. One is the Japanese National American Museum there, and then the Topaz Museum in Delta, Utah, has a version too. And I think he donated to them so they could raise money by selling copies for the museum.
Right.
I mean, one thing my dad always said is, okay, I will never charge for, like, well, that's one criticism he had of Zapruder film. I will never charge for the cat movie because that's blood money. And so I will just give it to the public and let them do it for free because otherwise it will never be shown. And he was right. So a lot of the famous movies, like, you know, on Snow and Falling Cedars has excerpts of the movie. Some different Hollywood movies have it, and lots of documentaries have excerpts because he gave it away free. And that was the point of it. He said, I want everybody around the world to know what happened in the camps. I don't want to make profit off of it because I think that's again, he considered it blood money on making money off of people suffering.
Yeah, well, good for him, and much credit to the strength of his footage, which definitely holds up against any of those Hollywood films that were accepted in that year, I'm sure. Well, I guess we're coming close to the end of our time. I'm wondering if you have any kind of closing thoughts that you'd like to give to the audience, either about your father or your work in general.
I guess one thing I would always emphasize, and I never really understood my father until recently, and it goes back to this whole notion of Christian witness. In fact, I'm writing my own book about my own political, social experiences called Eyewitness, like I. It's sort of like an I novels in Japanese literature, but eyewitness is a play on words. But one thing he always mentioned is that if we do not tell our stories, nobody will. So never take it for granted, because he thought all the everyday things he was doing is nobody would care. Wrong. It's really valuable. Like just movies of the street. Nobody thought it, but now they're very curious because of the cars and the fashion. So is to never assume that the world will always be the same. I think we could say that COVID now. And that everything you're doing, everybody you talk to is important. But more importantly, most of it will never be shown because the big media, Hollywood and all that, will never show it. So unless we tell our own stories, we will be forgotten in history. And so I think, if anything, I would encourage everybody, it doesn't matter who you are, um, keep a diary, keep note, keep a journal, write stories, anything. Tell your stories, whether it's nonfiction or fictional, it doesn't matter. And take a lot of photos, curate them, keep them on this, copy them on a DVD if you have to, so you don't lose them. But it's important to document things, because if you don't document it, it's gone. It's literally gone. And so my father always used to emphasize that. And he said, it's not just about being a filmmaker, it's about being a human being and just recording your life and sharing your stories, because they're all important. I would like to hear more stories about other Asian Americans that I never, Thai or Malaysian or others, but I rarely get to hear about them. So I think, if anything, we're all storytellers. And so the key is bring out your cameras, start taking pictures, start writing, start saving, documenting it, and sharing it. And I think if we do that, then we will be, we'll know our history better, and the children will know their history better. Otherwise, we basically have what I call cultural amnesia. Right? Everything's gone. And so I guess those are my parting thoughts about what I've learned from my father and, the history of, filmmaking and writing.
Well, certainly powerful statement. And I think, at this moment, especially when we're kind of looking at the passing of one generation and the emergence of another, it's so important to tell our stories and make sure that they pass on to the next generation. We have one last question from the audience. This is from Sheila Newland, who asks, can you give any advice on making sure that these stories proceed to the Yonsei and Gosei generations?
I think, I would make it fun, okay? Like, the kids love doing the Instagram, okay? And nowadays you just post it on there and you can only copies. But you could have like challenges, contests, fun things like holidays or whenever. And then I do it now and I get a huge number of hits, like the Fillmore Jazz Festival, which I enjoy, and I shoot a lot of video, or the San Francisco type. And since I have friends all over the world, they're all my friends. Well, that's cool. I've never seen it before, because they're not thinking about it. So I'm always taking just everyday pictures of people in Japantown, the restaurants, shops, Taiko, or just San Francisco in general. And my friends in Africa and Chile and they're all fascinated because they've never seen a personal version of San Francisco. They always see the Hollywood version or the news media version. And so they actually meet people. Social media, it's like, for many people, it's an eye-opener. They've never seen it before. So you could do anything. You just like interview grandma or grandpa or anything. Or like one I like is the cosplayers. All these kids, they all dress up. And so I interviewed some of these and I took pictures of cosplay. Huge number of hits. And I said, why do you like cosplay? What do you do? And so one woman got into a big spiel about how she makes the cool clothes and all that, and hanging out and her sense of pride. And I knew nothing about cosplay. And now I understand where they're coming from. So sometimes, it doesn't have to be your own stories. We could just ask people and learn a lot about the world, and share it with everybody online. So
well, that sounds like a great other piece of advice, and thank you for offering that, Sheridan. But we are coming to the end of our conversation, so I just wanted to thank you one more time for joining us and sharing so much about your father and your own work. We really appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to hopefully continuing conversations, and certainly invite you to join us for some more of the Tadaima virtual pilgrimage programs throughout the rest of the 7 weeks that we have left.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for your time and interest. And again, if you're ever in San Francisco, let me know, or you want to chat on Facebook, I'm on. All right. Take care.
Thank you, Sheridan. Bye.
Okay.